Indeed, quite remarkable. One purpose of the American bombing of the North, in Gerard Chalian's characterization, was to demoralize. 10. Economics of Maoism, in Dick Wilson, ed., China After the Cultural Revolution, New York, Random House, 1969. Selections from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Gray also notes that Western theorists of development are belatedly coming to some of the same. Kunkel Usans. 11. The Nation, March 6, 954. Reprinted in Vietnam Witness. pp. 1521. North Vietnam. 283. Ordinary citizens until, directly or indirectly, they pressurized the Hanoi government into suing for peace. Thus the bombing aimed at and doing the hard, patient work of many years. In a world whose basic problem is surely the backwardness and penury of 2/3 of the planet, the United States government, whatever excuses it may invoke, has systematically destroyed the economic infrastructure of one of the 3 or 4 underdeveloped countries which have seriously laid the foundations for their own industrialization. In the view of most countries, especially the newer ones, the American intervention in Vietnam is an attempt to stifle national independence and dignity. 12. This assessment is, I believe, entirely correct. The attempt has failed, dismally. There is no doubt that the spirit of national independence and dignity is high, and that the Vietnamese are proceeding to lay the basis for a modern society. I have some sense of their achievement in this regard from discussions with Vietnamese scientists and intellectuals. After a long and very productive meeting, I was asked to lecture about current work in linguistics at the Polytechnic University, and was able to do so for about 7 hours, to a group of 70 to 80 linguists and mathematicians. Their work, in this rather remote area of science and scholarship, was at an international level. I lectured approximately as I would at Tokyo, Oxford, or the Sorbonne. They are not familiar with the most recent work, because of the unavailability of recent materials, but they are, I believe, in a position to close the gap quickly if this problem is overcome, and to help them overcome it, in all fields, is one tiny effort that Americans might make in the hopeless task of compensating for the destruction of much. 12. Chaliand, pages 68 to 69. 284. At war with Asia. Of what the Vietnamese have created with remarkable enterprise, diligence, and courage. One of the members of the group had studied in East Berlin in one of the outstanding world centers of linguistics. Beyond what he could supply, they made good use of the meager resources available. Other scientists and intellectuals too were extremely eager to discuss current work and educational curricula, and to hear about colleagues whom they knew by reputation or had occasionally met at international conferences. So far as I could judge, the work in some branches of mathematics was also excellent, though here as well there was a general problem of access to recent work. The problem is not limited to technical and scientific areas. Thus, a professor of American literature approached me to speak about current writing. He had not seen an American novel for 15 years and wanted to know, in particular, what Norman Mailer had been doing lately. The students generally read English, but having little familiarity with the spoken language, were not able to follow a technical lecture. The translators, though excellent in general discussion, had considerable difficulty as the material became more technical and complex. One tried for about an hour, and then, apologetically, asked to be relieved. A second translator also made a noble effort, but the problems were severe. When they floundered, an older man in the audience intervened, and corrected mistakes or explained obscure points. It was obvious that he had followed everything very well and understood the material I was trying to present. Finally, he took over completely, and translated for several hours without a break. I was introduced to him later. He was the Minister of Higher Education of North Vietnam, Ta Keng Bu, a mathematician of note. North Vietnam. 285. Who had, in fact, sent me a reprint on mathematical linguistics several years ago that I could not read, since it was in Vietnamese, but that astonished me by its familiarity in the midst of the air war with current technical material. I did not think to ask, but I assume that this is the same Ta King Buetna who was a general during the First Indochina War. We only had a brief chance to talk afterward, to my great disappointment. I think there are few countries where the Minister of Higher Education could have taken over the task of translating an advanced technical lecture of this sort, or would have been willing to do so, and I was also impressed by the easy familiarity of relations within the group, the quality of the debate and discussion, as we proceeded. After my last lecture I was presented with several gifts. One a Vietnamese dictionary that the linguists had compiled and printed while they were dispersed in the forests and mountains during the air war. With justifiable pride, they observed that this work had been done while the American government was attempting to drive them back to the Stone Age. In fact, at the Polytechnic University, the Vietnamese are training scientists of whom any society could be proud. I was quite surprised to find myself lecturing on technical material in Hanoi and spending hours with colleagues in discussion of work in progress in the United States. This surprise is a result of my own failure to overcome regrettable stereotypes. The Vietnamese are devoting themselves not only to securing their independence in a bitter war but also to creating a modern society with a high level of general culture. Given half a chance, they will succeed in this, I am sure. It was a great personal pleasure for me to have. 286. At war with Asia. The opportunity to meet with Vietnamese colleagues, to explore our common interests, and to learn of their work and plans. In his will, President Ho Chi Minh wrote that though the war may last long and though new sacrifices will be necessary, still our rivers, our mountains, our men will always remain. With nuclear weapons, the United States could destroy these hopes, but short of that, I doubt that it can overcome the resistance of the Vietnamese or impose client governments on the people of Indochina. I left Southeast Asia, after this brief stay, with two overriding general impressions. The first was of the resilience and strength of Vietnamese society. It is conceivable that the United States may be able to break the will of the popular movements in the surrounding countries, perhaps even destroy the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, by employing the vast resources of violence and terror at its command. If so, it will create a situation in which, indeed, North Vietnam will necessarily dominate Indochina, for no other viable society will remain. The American intervention, like imperialist wars in general, has stirred up ethnic and class hatreds, set groups in conflict, and raised every conceivable antagonism to the level of a bloody conflict. The Vietnamese and the Thai, the two strongest and most dynamic societies in the region, are virtually at war. The Cambodian army has massacred Vietnamese. The Mio have been set against the Lao and other hill tribesmen. The Thai are driving the mountain tribesmen from their homes, and fear the native Lao population. The Thai and Saigon elites are now laying plans to devour Cambodia. Chinese nationalist troops remain active in border areas. Khmer mercenaries fight the Viet Cong, alongside Thai and South Koreans brought by the Ameri. North Vietnam. 287. Cans. Native elites, dependent on the FL.O of American goods and war expenditures, have been drawn into a brutal war against the peasantry. Not all of this is a direct consequence of the American war in Indochina, but there is no doubt that every potential conflict, every form of latent hostility, has been exacerbated as a result of the American intervention, often by design and direct manipulation. Even if the United States were to leave Indochina to its own beopland, there is, for the moment, not a sign of any such intention. This legacy of hatred will remain, embittering the lives of the people of Indochina and denying them the hope of creating a decent future. Chapter 6. On War Crimes. We are not judges. We are witnesses. Our task is to make mankind bear witness to these terrible crimes and to unite humanity on the side of justice in Vietnam. With these words, Bertrand Russell opened the second session of the International War Crimes Tribunal in November 1967. The American people were given no opportunity, at that time, to bear witness to the terrible crimes recorded in the proceedings of the tribunal. As Russell writes in his introduction to the first edition, it is in the nature of imperialism that citizens of the imperial power are always among the last to know or care about circumstances in the colonies. The evidence brought before the tribunal was suppressed by the self-censorship of the mass media, and its proceedings, when they appeared in print, were barely reviewed. This is an edited and extended version of the introduction to Against the Crime of Silence, Proceedings of the Russell International War Crimes Tribunal, 2nd ed. New York, Simon & Schuster, forthcoming. On War Crimes. 289. Russell wrote that it is in the United States that this book can have its most profound effect. He expressed his faith in the essential decency of the American people, his faith that the ordinary man will react in a civilized way when he is given the facts. We have yet to show that this faith is justified. Russell hoped to arouse consciousness in order to create mass resistance. In the smug streets of Europe and the complacent cities of North America. By now, there are few who can honestly claim to be unaware of the character of the American war in Vietnam. There are few, for example, who can now claim ignorance of the new orators and legislators described, in testimony to the tribunal, by West German physician who spent 6 years in Vietnam. But consciousness has yet to create mass resistance. The streets of Europe and the cities of North America remain smug and complacent with the significant and honorable exception of the student youth. The record of the tribunal stands as an eloquent and dramatic appeal to renounce the crime of silence. The crime was compounded by the silence that greeted its detailed documentation and careful studies. However, although no honest effort was made to deal with the factual record made public in the proceedings of the tribunal, its work did receive some oblique response. The Pentagon was forced to admit that it was, indeed, using anti-personnel weapons in its attacks against North Vietnam, though it could not resist the final lie that the targets were radar stations and anti-aircraft batteries. The hypocritical claim that the American bombing policy was one of magnificent restraint, that its targets were steel and concrete, was finally exploded beyond repair. A State Department functionary who had become an object of general contempt for his unending deceit regarding Vietnam demeaned himself. 290. At war with Asia. Still further by informing journalists that he had no intention of playing games with a 94-year-old Briton, referring to one of the truly great men of the 20th century. Those who were prepared to go beyond the mass media for information could learn something about the work of the tribunal from such journals as Liberation, as could readers of the foreign press, in particular Le Monde. The tribunal proceedings, along with a documentary study in the name of America One which appeared in the same year, and the honest and courageous work of many fine war correspondents, helped to crumble the defenses erected by the government, with the partial collusion of the media, to keep the reality of the war from popular consciousness. Though not reported honestly, the tribunal was sharply criticized. Many of the criticisms are answered, effectively I believe, in Part 1 of the proceedings. There are 2 criticisms that retain a certain validity, however. The participants, the jurors and the witnesses, were undoubtedly biased. They made no attempt, in fact, to conceal this bias, this profound hatred of murder and wanton destruction carried out by a foreign invader with unmatched technological resources. A second and less frivolous criticism that might be raised is that the indictment is, in a sense, superfluous and redundant. This is a matter that deserves more serious attention. The Pentagon will gladly supply, on request, such information as the quantity of ordnance expended in Indochina. From 1965 through 1969 this amounts to about 4.5 million tons by aerial bombardment. This is 9 times the tonnage of bombing in the entire Pacific theater in world. One published by clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. Annandale, The Turnpike Press, 1968. On War Crimes. 291. War 2, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki, over 70 tons of bombs for every square mile of Vietnam, north and south. About 500 pounds of bombs for every man, woman and child in Vietnam. The total of ordnance expended is more than doubled when ground and naval attacks are taken into account. With no further information than this, a person who has not lost his senses must realize that the war is an overwhelming atrocity. A few weeks before the tribunal began its second session, 49 volunteers of the International Voluntary Services wrote a letter to President Johnson describing the war as an overwhelming atrocity. 4 of the staff leaders resigned. These volunteers, who had worked for many years in Vietnam, were among the few Americans who had some human contact with the Vietnamese people. Their activities, and even the letter of protest, indicate their belief surprisingly uncritical in the legitimacy of the American effort in Vietnam. Point 3. In this letter they refer to the free strike zones, the refugees, the spraying of herbicide on crops, the napalm, the deserted villages, the sterile valleys, the forests with the huge swaths cut out, and the long abandoned rice checks. They speak of the refugees forcibly resettled, landless, in isolated desolate places which are turned into colonies of mendicants, of the Saigon slums, security-ridden with disease and the compulsion towards crime, of refugees generated not by Viet. To Edward S. Herman, Atrocities in Vietnam, Myths and Realities, Boston, Pilgrim Press, 1970. In a careful analysis, Herman estimates South Vietnamese civilian casualties at over 1 million dead and over 2 million wounded, and he notes that 2 years ago the total number of refugees, generated mainly by the American scorched earth policy, was estimated at almost 4 million by the Kennedy Committee of the 90th Congress. The letter appears as an appendix in Don Luce and John Sommer, Vietnam, The Unheard Voices, Ithaca, NY, Cornell University Press, 1969, pp. 31521. 292. At War with Asia. Counterterrorism, but by a policy of the war, an American policy, a process described by cynical American scholars as urbanization or modernization. Experts in pacification, peace researchers, to use the preferred term, assure us that the only sense in which we have demolished the society of Vietnam is the sense in which every modernizing country abandons reactionary traditionalism. For the methods of urbanization by which we have so advanced the modernization of Vietnam are described, for example, by Orville and Jonathan Sill. We both spent several weeks in Kinh Ngai some 6 months before the Song Mai incident. We flew daily with the FAC's forward air control. What we saw was a province utterly destroyed. In August 1st, 1967, during Operation Benton, the pacification camps became so full that army units were ordered not to generate any more FAs. The army complied, but search and destroy operations continued. Only now peasants were not warned before an airstrike was called in on their village. They were killed in their villages because there was no room for them in the swamped pacification camps. The usual warning by helicopter loudspeaker or airdropped leaflets was stopped. Every civilian on the ground was assumed to be enemy by the pilots by nature of living in Kinh Ngai, which was largely a free fire zone. Pilots, servicemen not unlike Pauley and Mitchell, continued to carry out their orders. Village after village was destroyed from the air as a matter of a de facto policy. Airstrikes on civilians became a matter of routine. It was under these circumstances of official acquiescence to the destruction of the countryside and its people that the massacre of Songmy occurred. Such atrocities were and are the logical consequences. 4. Ethiopia, New York Review, letter, February 1st 3, 1969. On war crimes. 293. Of the war directed against an enemy indistinguishable from the people. 5. Elsewhere, Orville still quotes the news one discorrect correspondent returning from Qinghai province, having had experience in Europe during World War II. He said what he had seen was much worse than what the Nazis had done to Europe. So lads, had he written about it in these terms? No. 6. Vietnamese-speaking field workers of the American Friends Service Committee describe more recent stages of modernization as seen from the ground. In one such removal, during Operation Bold Mariner in January 1, 969, 12,000 peasants from the Biak Peninsula were taken to a waterless camp near Qinghai, over whose guarded gate floated a banner saying, "We thank you for liberating us from communist terror." These people had been given an hour to get out before the USS New Jersey began to shell their homes. After 8 weeks of imprisonment, they were ferried back to what was left of their villages, given a few sheets of corrugated metal and told to fend for themselves. When asked what they would live on until new crops could be raised, the Vietnamese camp commander said, "Maybe they can fish." 7. Reports by Western observers are limited to areas more or less under American control. The most intensive attacks are therefore unreported in the West. We do, however, have Vietnamese reports, which will perhaps be given somewhat greater credence than heretofore now that there. 5. New York Times, letter, November 26, 1969. The War in Qinghai and Canton provinces is described in unforgettable detail by Jonathan Sill, The Military Half, New York, Vintage Books, 1968. 6. Pop Me Some Oinks, New Republic, January 3, 1970. 7. Vietnam, 1969, AFSC White Paper, May 5, 1969, 160 North 1/5. Street, Philadelphia, Pa. 19102. 294. At War with Asia. Incident at Song Mai, which they described with accuracy at the time, has finally been made public. For select one such report virtually at random. In Trang Bang on the evening of October 24, 1969, 3 flights of B-52s made 3 sorties, killing 47 people, wounding many others, mostly children and old folks, completely leveling 450 houses and devastating 650 hectares of fields. On the night of October 25, B-52s flew 9 attacks in Qinghai and Nam provinces, dumping more than 1,000 tons of bombs, killing 300 people, wounding 236 others, setting afire 564 houses and damaging hundreds of hectares of fields and orchards. In Plaku, a fertile region, many flights of B-52s came in on the morning of October 1 and released 700 tons of bombs which wrought havoc in hundreds of hectares of fields and orchards. In the area of New Iba and the villages of Ninh Than, Hiep Ninh Than, Hiep Ninh of the Tain in Cao Dai persuasion, the U.S. puppets resorted to toxic chemicals to destroy the crops and kill civilians. American hovercraft dumped tens of thousands of CS cans while helicopters dropped hundreds of thousands of toxic bombs on the villages. Moreover, enemy guns and mortars fired more than 5,000 gas shells over 1,000 people, affecting 13 children and 13 killed. Ninh Than and Hiep Ninh villages and more than 100 hectares of crops completely destroyed. 8. And on, without end. The facts are, of course, familiar in a general way to the highest authorities in the United States. The Under-Secretary of the Air Force, Townsend Hoops, wrote a memorandum in March 1, 1968, in which he pointed out that South Vietnam, the struggle, publication of the NLF Information Commission, number 48, November 1, 1969. On War Crimes. 295. ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and U.S. forces in the towns and cities are now responding to mortar fire from nearby villages by the liberal use of artillery and air strikes. This response is causing widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties among people who were considered only a few weeks ago to be secure elements of the GVN, South Vietnamese Government, constituency. The present mode and tempo of operations in SVN is already destroying cities, villages and crops, and is creating civilian casualties at an increasing rate. 9. Hoops describes the savage American reaction to the conquest of many cities by the National Liberation Front in the Tet Offensive in January 1, 1968, for example, in Saigon, where in an effort to dislodge their 1,000 soldiers who had taken the city, artillery and air strikes were repeatedly used against densely populated areas of the city, causing heavy civilian casualties, or in Hue, where the American reoccupation left a devastated and prostrate city. 80% of the buildings had been reduced to rubble, and in the smashed ruins lay 2,000 dead civilians. 10. 3. 9. The Limits of Intervention, New York, David Mackay Company, p. 189. 10. The NLF claims that 2,000 victims of the American bombardment were buried in mass graves. See Wilfred Burchett, Manchester Guardian, December 6, 1969. This is consistent with Hoops's account. Hoops states that after 10 days of fighting, 300 local officials and prominent citizens were found in a mass grave. This corresponds roughly with the estimate of Police Chief Don Conglap, who estimated the total number executed as 200. He also gives the figure of 3,776 civilian casualties in the Battle of Hue. Stuart Harris, The Times, London, March 27, 1968. Apart from Harris, I know of only one journalist who has given a detailed eyewitness report from Hue at the time, namely Mark Rabaud. United States authorities were unable to show him there. Mass graves reported by the United States Air Mission. Rabaud reports 4,000 civilians killed during the reconquest of the assassinated city of Hue. Lament, April 1, 1968. American Friends Service Committee staff people in Hue are unable to confirm the reports of mass graves, though they reported many civilians shot and killed during the reconquest of the city. See the report by John Sullivan of the AFSC, May 9, 1968. For attempts to evaluate government propaganda on mass killings in Hue, C.D. Gareth Porter and Lenny Ackland, Vietnam, the 296. At war with Asia. Quarters of the city's people were rendered homeless and looting was widespread. Members of the 7/RVN being the worst offenders. Elsewhere, the story was much the same. Everywhere, the U.S. ARVN forces mounted counterattacks of great severity. In the Delta region below Saigon, half of the city of Mytho, with a population of 70,000, was destroyed by artillery and air strikes in an effort to eject a strong VC force. In Bentron February 7, at least 1,000 civilians were killed and 1,500 wounded in an effort to dislodge 2,500 VC. 11. According to Hoops, The combat photographer David Douglas Duncan, whose war experience covers World War II, Korea, Algeria, and the French War in Vietnam, was appalled by the U.S.ARVN method of freeing Hugh. He quotes him as saying, "The Americans pounded the citadel and surrounding city almost to dust with airstrikes, napalm runs, artillery and naval gunfire, and the direct cannon fire from tanks and recoilless rifles, a total effort to root out and kill every enemy soldier. The mind reels at the carnage, cost, and ruthlessness of it." 12. Hoops also reports that of the North Vietnamese force of 1,000 that had taken Hue in a day, a sizable part escaped. Compare the figures on casualties cited above. These events occurred too late to be considered by the tribunal. I need not elaborate on what has been revealed since. Some indications are given in earlier chapters. 4. Bloodbath argument. Christie 1111 Dury, November 5, 1969, Viet 11 am. International, December 1, 969, 6 Sensley Street Treat, London WCI, Tran Van Din, Fear of a Bloodbath, New Republic, December 6, 969. The only other accounts I have seen merely convey information given out by American government sources. 11 Hoops, Op. Cit. p. 141. 12 Ibid. p. 142. On War Crimes. 297. Far more, see the study by Edward Herman, cited in footnote 2 above. I have mentioned all of this in connection with the question raised earlier, whether it is necessary, today, to publicize the detailed reports of the tribunal. Is it not true that by now the monstrous character of the war has penetrated the American consciousness so fully that further documentation is superfluous? Unfortunately, the answer must be negative. To see why, consider again the case of Townsend Hoops, who is now a leading dove. A reviewer of his book in the New York Times describes it as the most persuasive presentation of the case for American withdrawal from Vietnam. It is instructive to compare his position with that of the Hawks on the one hand and that of the tribunal on the other. Such a comparison shows how narrow is the gap between the Hawks and the Doves, and how far removed the Dove-Hawk position still remains from the consciousness that Russell hoped would be aroused by the factual record and historical and legal argument of the tribunal. I want to stress that Hoops's is one of the most humane and enlightened voices to be heard within the mainstream of American opinion today, surely among those who have had any significant role in the formation and implementation of policy. For this reason, his views are important and deserve careful consideration. Our early strategy, as Hoops describes it, was to kill as many Viet Cong as possible with artillery and air strikes. As late as the fall of 1966, a certain aura of optimism surrounded this strategy. Some were ready to believe that, in its unprecedented mobility and massive firepower, American forces had discovered the military answer to endless Asian manpower and Oriental indifference to death. For a few weeks they hung in the expectant wash. 298. At war with Asia. Inked in air the exhilarating possibility that the most modern, mobile, professional American field force in the nation's history was going to lay to rest the time-honored superstition, the knowing unease of military planners, that a major land war against Asian hordes is by definition a disastrous plunge into quicksand for any Western Army. 13. But this glorious hope was dashed. The endless manpower of Vietnam, the Asian hordes with their Oriental indifference to death, confounded our strategy. And our bombing of North Vietnam also availed us little, given the nature of the enemy. As Hoops explains, quoting a senior United States Army officer, Caucasians cannot really imagine what armed labor can do. In short, our strategy was rational, but it presupposed civilized Western values. We believe the enemy can be forced to be reasonable, that is, to compromise or even capitulate, because we assume he wants to avoid pain, death, and material destruction. We assume that if these are inflicted on him with increasing severity, then at some point in the process he will want to stop the suffering. Ours is a plausible strategy for those who are rich, who love life and fear pain. But happiness, wealth, and power are expectations that constitute a dimension far beyond the experience, and probably beyond the emotional comprehension, of the Asian poor. 14. Hoops does not tell us how he knows that the Asian poor do not love life or fear pain, or that happiness is probably beyond their emotional comprehension. 15. But he does go on to explain how ideologues in Asia make use of these. 1 Ibid, p. 64. 14 Shbid, pp. 79, 128-29. 15. This is not quite accurate. He does provide a brief philosophical discussion of Buddhist beliefs, which tend to create a positive impetus toward honorable death. On war crimes. 299. Characteristics of the Asian hordes. Their strategy is to convert Asia's capacity for endurance in suffering into an instrument for exploiting a basic vulnerability of the Christian West. They do this by inviting the West to carry its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide. The Asians justify us by a readiness to struggle, suffer, and die on a scale that seems to us beyond the bounds of humanity. At that point we hesitate, for, remembering Hitler and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we realize anew that genocide is a terrible burden to bear. Thus, by their willingness to die, the Asian hordes, who do not love life, who fear and know pain and cannot conceive of happiness, exploit our basic weakness, our Christian values, which make us reluctant to bear the burden of genocide, the final conclusion of our strategic logic. Is it really possible to read these passages without being stunned by their crudity and callousness? James Thompson, East Asian specialist at the Department of State and the White House between 1961 and 1966, has written of an unprovable factor that relates to bureaucratic detachment, the ingredient of cryptocracy. I do not mean to imply any conscious contempt for Asian loss of life on the part of Washington officials. But I do mean to imply that bureaucratic detachment may well be compounded by a traditional Western sense that there are so many Asians, after all, that Asians have a fatalism about life and a disregard for its loss, that they are cruel and barbaric to their own people, and that they are very different from us, and all look alike. And I do mean to imply that the upshot of such subliminal views is a subliminal question whether Asians, and particularly Asian peasants, and most particularly Asian communists, are really people like you. 300. At war with Asia. And me. To put the matter another way, would we have pursued quite such policies and quite such military tactics if the Vietnamese were white? 16. Let us continue. Seeing that our strategy, though plausible, has failed, the Air Force staff worked out several alternative strategies, which they presented to the new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, in March 1, 1968. The Air Staff preferred the following: an intensified bombing campaign in the north, including attacks on the dock area of Haiphong, on a railroad equipment within the Chinese buffer zone, and on the dike system that controlled irrigation for NVN agriculture. 17. But Hoops and Air Force Secretary Harold Brown demurred. Why? They felt there was little assurance such a campaign could either force NVN to the conference table, or even significantly reduce its war effort. Furthermore, it was a course embodying excessive risks of confrontation with Russia. If they had any other objections to intensified bombing of the dike system of North Vietnam, Hoops does not inform us of them. 18. Hoops himself preferred, rather, the following tactics. 16. James C. Thompson, Jr., How Could Vietnam Happen? In Robert Manning and Michael Janeway, eds. Eerie, An Atlantic Chronicle of the United States and Vietnam 1966–1969, Boston, Little, Brown and Co. 1 969, p. 206, reprinted from the Atlantic Monthly, April 1968. 1. Hoops, Op. Cit. p. 176. 18 as Gabriel Colco notes, in testimony to the Russell Tribunal. The barbarism of Seyss-Mitteldorp in opening the dikes in Holland was considered one of the most monstrous crimes of World War II, and was prominent among the charges that led to his death sentence at Nuremberg. Note also Colco's discussion of the bombing of dikes in the Korean War, and the testimony given regarding American bombing of dikes in North Vietnam. Eyewitness reports of the bombing of dikes in the Red River Delta have appeared in the American press. See Christian Science Monitor, September 8, 967, quoted in My American Power and the New Mandarins, New York, Pantheon Books, 1 969, p. 15. On War Crimes. 301. A campaign designed to substitute tactical air power for a large portion of the search and destroy operations currently conducted by ground forces, thus permitting the ground troops to concentrate on a perimeter defense of the heavily populated areas. The analysis seemed to show that tactical air power could provide a potent left jab to keep the enemy in the south off balance, while the USARVN ground forces adopted a modified enclaves strategy, featuring enough aggressive reconnaissance to identify and break up developing attacks, but designed primarily to protect the people of Vietnam and, by population control measures, to force exposure of the VC political cadres. 19. As we know from other sources, the VC political cadres thus exposed were to be eliminated by Operation Phoenix, which, in the year 1968, is claimed to have killed 8,393 persons. 20. D. Gareth Porter, a graduate student in Southeast Asian Studies at Cornell, states that the Phoenix program is responsible for the death or capture of 3,500 people. The majority of those arrested are merely low-level propagandists, supply agents and others who are part-time helpers. 19 Hoops, Op. Cit. pp. 176-77. 20 C. Senator Charles E. Goodell, New Republic, November 22, 1969, cited in Herman, Op. Cit. Also Judith Coburn and Jeffrey Cowan. Training for Terror, a Deliberate Policy. Village Voice, December 1, 1969. On Population Control Measures, see William Niswonger, Rural Pacification in Vietnam, Praja Special Studies, New York, Frederick A. Praja, 1967. For some discussion, see My American Power and the New Mandarins, pp. 37 ff, and for earlier precedents during the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, Ibid, pp. 195-203. The exact figures of those neutralized by Operation Phoenix vary in the several available accounts. William Colby, principal official in charge of pacification programs in Saigon, claims that in 1969, 187 Viet Cong were killed, 8,515 captured, their fate is unrecorded, and 4,832 rallied to the government. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, February 2, 970, states that 15,000 Viet Cong infrastructure, that is, civilians, were neutralized in 1968, and a somewhat large number in the first 10 months of 1969, see Herman, Op. Cit. 302. At War with Asia. In the NLF ranks. 21 He concludes his article with the following paragraphs. What is most significant about the program is that provincial police officials are expected to meet specific quotas for eliminating enemy guards each month, although the official term for these quotas is goals. As in the anti-communist denunciation campaign and the strategic Hamlet program, those officials who fail to meet the goals lose favor with the government, those who produce results are promoted. Thus quotas are likely to be met by applying practices which are already routine for the police. The victims are the people of South Vietnam, who must suffer yet another intensification of the terror which they have come to associate with the police. This totalitarian-oriented machinery of arbitrary arrest and political surveillance, which the United States helped shape with money and advice, will not be dismantled if the Nixon administration manages to keep the present military regime in power. The men who have been put in office through American intervention have been frank enough to say that the aid of liberal institutions is only for American consumption. Perhaps this police state will be one of America's legacies to the Vietnamese people. Len Ackland, a former IVS worker in South Vietnam and then a team leader and analyst in Vietnam for the Rand Corporation, comments on the Phoenix program. What this all means is that civilians are being murdered, people who serve the political party, the National Liberation Front, as tax collectors, clerks, postmen, etc. This policy would be analogous to the administration murdering dissidents in the Internal Revenue Service, the juvenile delinquents of the Moratorium Committee, or the Democratic National Committee. 21 Saigon Secret Police, The Nation, April 27, verse 970. 22 The Peace Times, publication of the Vietnam Moratorium Committee, March 7, verse 970. On War Crimes. 303. Those who would counter by pointing out that there is, more precisely, was, a civil war in South Vietnam might remember that the Viet Minh did, naively, accept the terms of political struggle after Geneva until forced by the South Vietnamese government and the United States to use counterforce to survive, as the American government specialist Douglas Bike puts it. 23. Returning to Hoops, in a letter of February 1, 1968, to Clark Clifford, he explains his preferences in terms similar to those quoted above, page 301. We should, he urges, stop the militarily insignificant bombing of North Vietnam and undertake a less ambitious ground strategy in the south, trying merely to control, the technical term is protect, the populated areas. This policy would give us a better chance to develop the definable geographical area of South Vietnamese political and economic stability, and by reducing the intensity of the war tempo, it could materially improve the prospect of our staying the course for an added number of grinding years, without rending our own society. Point 24. Compare these recommendations with the tactics now being followed by the Nixon administration. Secretary of the Army Stanley Rizza, testifying before the House Appropriations Committee, 25, refused to predict how long the war would last, but he sees time as running on our side. Therefore, if we can just buy some time in the US by these periodic progressive withdrawals and the American people can just shore up their patience and determination, I think we can bring this to a successful conclusion. 23 See My American Power and the New Mandarins, pp. 46 ff. 365-66, for relevant quotes from Pike. 24 Hoops, Op. Sit, pp. 154-55. My Italics. 25 October 8, verse 969, released December 2nd. Quoted in I.F. Stone's Weekly, December 1st 969. 304. At War with Asia. To this remark General Westmoreland added, I have never made the prediction that this would be other than a long war. Thus the present Secretary of the Army agrees with the Hoops letter of February 1, 1968, that we may be able to stay the course for an added number of grinding years if the American people will consent, if this policy will not rend our own society. And with this judgment, finally, Mr. Hoops disagrees. Vietnam is not, of course, the only source of division in America today, but it is the most pervasive issue of our discord, the catalytic agent that stimulates and magnifies all other divisive issues. In particular, there can be no real truce between the generations, no end to the bitterness and alienation of even the large majority of our youth that is neither revolutionary nor irresponsible until Vietnam is terminated. 26. This is the primary reason why, he urges, we must withdraw from Vietnam. I do not want to suggest that the spectrum from Hoops to Rizzo exhausts the contemporary debate over Vietnam, but there is little doubt that it represents the range of views and assumptions expressed within the mainstream of responsible American opinion. With this observation, we can return to the tribunal. Its assumptions, of course, fall entirely outside this spectrum. It is unfortunate but undeniable that the central issue in the American debate over Vietnam, in respectable circles, has been the question, can we win at an acceptable cost? The doves and the hawks disagree. Hawks become doves as their assessment of the probabilities and costs shifts, and if the American conquest were to prove. 26 Op. Cit. p. 236. On war crimes. 305. Successful, they would no doubt resume their former militancy. The tribunal is concerned with very different questions. It does not ask whether the United States can win at an acceptable cost, but rather whether it should win, whether it should be involved at all in the internal affairs of the Vietnamese, whether it has any right to try to settle or even influence these internal matters by force. Inevitably, despite disclaimers, the Russell Tribunal will evoke memories of Nuremberg and Tokyo. With the revelation of the Song Mai atrocities, the issues raised in the war crimes trials have become, at last, a matter of public concern. We can hardly suppress the memory of our initiative at Nuremberg and Tokyo, or the explicit insistence of the United States prosecutor, Robert Jackson, that the principles of Nuremberg are to be regarded as universal in their applicability. After the trials, he wrote, "If certain acts and violations of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. We are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us." 21. It might be argued that the verdicts of Nuremberg and Tokyo were merely the judgment of victors, who sought vengeance and retribution rather than justice. I think there is some merit in this accusation, but right or wrong, it does not affect the broader question of the legitimacy of the principles that were recognized in the Charter of the War Crimes Tribunals. Legal niceties aside, the citizen is justified in taking these principles as his guide. 27 Quoted in an article by Judith Coburn and Jeffrey Cowan, "The War Criminals Hedge Their Bets," Village Voice, December 4, 1969. 306. At War with Asia. A classic liberal doctrine holds that generally speaking, it is the drawn sword of the nation which checks the physical power of its rulers. 28. It is the fundamental duty of the citizen to resist and to restrain the violence of the state. Those who choose to disregard this responsibility can justly be accused of complicity in war crimes, which is itself designated as a crime under international law in the principles of the Charter of Nuremberg. This is, in essence, the challenge posed to us by the Russell Tribunal. Richard A. Falk has written about this matter in an important recent article. 29. He points out that Song Mai stands out as a landmark atrocity in the history of warfare, and its occurrence is a moral challenge to the entire American society. Nevertheless, it would be misleading to isolate the awful happenings at Song Mai from the overall conduct of the war. Among the war policies that might, he argues, be found illegal are these: 1. The Phoenix Program, 2. Aerial and naval bombardment of undefended villages. 3. Destruction of the crops and forests. 4. Search and destroy missions. 5. Harassment and interdiction fire. 6. Forcible removal of civilian population. 7. Reliance on a variety of weapons prohibited by treaty. That these policies have been followed on a massive scale is not in question. Falk argues that if found to be illegal, such policies should be discontinued forthwith and those responsible for the policy and its execution should be prosecuted as war criminals by appropriate tribunals. He also notes how broad was the conception of criminal responsibility developed under 28 Wilhelm von Humboldt, The Limits of State Action, 1792. ed. J. W. Burrow, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1969. 29 The Circle of Responsibility, The Nation, January 26, verse 970. Falk is Bank Professor of International Law and Practice at Princeton University. On War Crimes. 307. American Initiative in the War Crimes Trials. In Falk's paraphrase, the majority judgment of the Tokyo Tribunal held as follows. A leader must take affirmative acts to prevent war crimes or dissociate himself from the government. If he fails to do one or the other, then by the very act of remaining in a government of a state guilty of war crimes, he becomes a war criminal. And Falk emphasizes the obligation of resistance for the citizen, if the evidence is strong that the state is engaged in criminal acts. It is correct, but irrelevant, to stress the vast differences in the political processes of America and the fascist states. It is correct, but hardly relevant, to point out that the United States has stopped short of carrying its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide, hoops. Thus, one cannot compare American policy to that of Nazi Germany, as of 1942. It would be more difficult to argue that American policy is not comparable to that of fascist Japan, or of Germany prior to the final solution. There may be those who are prepared to tolerate any policy less ghastly than crematoria and death camps and to reserve their horror for the particular forms of criminal insanity perfected by the Nazi technicians. Others will not lightly disregard comparisons which, though harsh, may well be accurate. Nazi Germany was sui generis, of that there is no doubt. But we should have the courage and honesty to face the question whether the principles applied to Nazi Germany and fascist Japan do not, as well, apply to the American war in Vietnam. Recall the objectives of denazification, as formulated by those who were responsible for this policy. General Lucius D. Clay, in 1950, described the primary 308. At war with Asia. Objective as follows: to safeguard the new German democracy from Nazi influence and to make it possible for anti-Nazi, non-Nazi and outspoken democratic individuals to enter public life and replace the Nazi elements which had dominated all life in Germany from 1933 to 1945. He reports. This was, perhaps, the most extensive legal procedure the world had ever witnessed. In the U.S. zone alone more than 1.3 million persons had been involved, of whom over 3 2/3 million were found chargeable, and of these some 800,000 persons were made subject to penalty for their party affiliations or actions. All this was, of course, apart from the punishment of war criminals, many of whom were high-ranking Nazis. 30. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery saw one of the most important objects of the Allied forces in Germany as to change the heart and the way of life of the German people. Denazification involved a cultural and ideological change, to proceed side by side with economic reconstruction. 31 We can certainly ask whether 3 2/3 million Germans in the United States zone were more guilty of complicity in war crimes than any Americans. and we can ask whether a cultural and ideological change in the United States, at the very least, is not imperative if many others, who fear neither pain nor death, are to be spared the fate of Vietnam. Some of these questions arise in a revealing exchange between Townsend Hoops and two journalists who published an interview with him in the Village Voice. See footnote 27 above. Hoops insisted that 30. The present state of denazification, reprinted in Constantine. Fitzgibbon, Denazification, New York, W. W. Norton and Co. 1 969, pp. 130133. 31 Fitzgibbon, Ibid, p. 120. On War Crimes. 309. War crimes tribunals would be the worst thing that could happen to this country. That would amount to McCarthyism. You're proposing a system of legal guilt for top elected officials. The traditional way to deal with these top officials is to throw the rascals out. In an article in which he comments on the curious piece of reporting of Judith Coburn and Jeffrey Cowan, Hoops explains further that a democratic and an entirely elective form of retribution has already been visited upon Lyndon Johnson, and that his closest collaborators may also be excluded from high office. 32. Hoops does not say whether this form of retribution would also have been more appropriate in the case of the Japanese and German war criminals should the West then merely have guaranteed a democratic election in which they might have been deprived of office. He does, however, reject the suggestion that civilian officials be held accountable for such incidents as the Song Mai massacre, or for the bombing of North Vietnam, or for such policies as those enumerated by Falk, cited above. In fact, Coburn and Cowan report that in the friendliest possible terms, he accused our generation of wanting to impose a totalitarian system of morality which would lead to universal anarchy. Coburn and Cowan, in turn, ask if Tojo can be sentenced to be executed by an American war crime tribunal for leading Japan into a war of Scion, should the only punishment for an American president be that he is voted out of office while his Secretary of Defense serves a secure term as President of the World Bank? This seems a not unreasonable question, certainly not unreasonable for those who take seriously the statement of 32. The Nuremberg Suggestion, Washington Monthly, January 1, 970. 310. At war with Asia. Justice Jackson, quoted earlier. Nor do Coburn and Cowan appear unreasonable when they add, the anarchists who frighten us most are those who wield the big bombs, control the courts, and assume for themselves the power to declare all their enemies outlaws. Hoops strongly disagrees. It is these strange conclusions that make the Coburn-Cowan article such a curious piece of reporting. To him it is crystal clear that such views could not conceivably be held or expressed by anyone who was a young man during the Second World War or who was engaged in the mortal struggles of its aftermath in Greece, in Germany, in Berlin, in Korea. Only sensitive, clever children could be moved to such harsh judgments, unshaped by historical perspective and untempered by any first-hand experience with the unruly forces at work in this near-cyclonic century. Those who designed our Vietnam policy were struggling in good conscience to uphold the Constitution and to serve the broad national interest according to their lights. They were, almost uniformly, those considered when they took office to be among the ablest, the best, the most humane and liberal men that could be found for public trust, and no one doubted their honest, high-minded pursuit of the best interests of their country, and indeed of the whole non-communist world, as they perceived these interests. To be sure, they were deluded by the tensions of the Cold War years. The tragedy of Vietnam, as he sees it, is that these good men were unable to perceive that the triumph of the national revolution in Vietnam would be neither a triumph for Moscow and Peking nor a disaster for the United States. Furthermore, their policies received wide public support. Set against these facts, the easy designation of individuals as deliberate or imputed war criminals is shock. On war crimes. 31.1. Inly glib, even if one allows for the inexperience of the young. Similarly, it would be absurd even to ask whether a war crimes tribunal, even in principle, should try Nixon and Kissinger as war criminals, even though they continue to buy some time in the US so that the war can be brought to a successful conclusion, in the words of the present Secretary of the Army. One should, I believe, agree with Townsend Hoops that what the country needs is not retribution, but therapy in the form of deeper understanding of our problems and of each other. No one, to my knowledge, has urged that those responsible for the massacre of the people of Vietnam, their forced evacuation from their homes, 33, and the destruction of their country be jailed or executed, or even that denazification procedures of the sort instituted against 13 million Germans in the United States zone be applied to the American population. Let us, by all means, try rather to achieve a deeper understanding of our problems. Among these problems is the fact that one of the most liberal and enlightened commentators on contemporary affairs can assure us that Asian hordes care nothing for death, fear no pain, and cannot conceive of happiness, while as for us it is our Christian values that impel us to stop short of a final solution. Among our problems is the fact that the same spokesman can summon up the kind of historical perspective that sees our intervention in Greece in the 1940s as a mortal struggle, against whom? Nor the fact that those who were, quite possibly, the most humane and liberal men. 33. Coburn and Cowan report the views of Ambassador Ellsworth Bankar, who says in a statement to Congress on the refugee situation that the figures may be misleading, since the war-torn Vietnamese are used to disruption and have been moving around for centuries. Since this is true, to a far greater extent, of the American population, there would presumably be even less reason to protest if they were driven from their homes by a foreign invader. 312. At war with Asia. That could be found for public trust could set out to annihilate the Vietnamese in the belief, whether honest or feigned it hardly matters, that they were combating a chimeraist monolith that included Moscow and Peking, in 1965. One of our problems is the doctrine developed by Mr. Hoops, in accordance with which, to take his words literally, no policy carried out by the best American leaders with wide public support could be criminal, could in principle demand any response other than to throw the rascals out. In fact, is it not a trifle naive, or even glib, of Mr. Hoops to suggest that we throw the rascals out? Did we vote the rascals in? No one who considers carefully the role of the executive in civil-military decisions in the post-war world, or the role of the private economic empires in determining national policy, either in their own protected domain or within the parliamentary system itself, or the kinds of choices presented by the two competing candidate-producing organizations, can so easily speak of throwing the rascals out. It would require social revolution, leading to a redistribution of power throughout the industrial as well as the political system, for a significant change to take place in the top decision-making positions in American society. For this reason alone, one must fully accept the judgment that what the country needs is not retribution, but therapy in the form of deeper understanding of our problems and appropriate action to remedy these problems, which, given our enormous power, are problems of life and death for a good part of the world. These problems should be on the agenda for any thinking person. More immediate, however, is the problem of bringing about a withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam. There is no indication that any such policy is on war crimes. 313. Visioned at present. Rather, it is clear that the United States government is hoping to stay the course until victory is achieved, adjusting tactics when necessary to buy some time at home. For this reason, the proceedings of the tribunal are a document of first importance. The spirit and convictions that underlie it must, as Russell hoped, become a part of the consciousness of all Americans. Richard Falk concludes the article I quoted earlier. Given the perils and horrors of the contemporary world, it is time that individuals everywhere called their government to account for indulging or ignoring the daily evidences of barbarism. The obsolete pretensions of sovereign prerogative and military necessity had better be challenged soon if life on earth is to survive. The tribunal takes one step small, perhaps, but significant. The tribunal, or another like it, should come to Czechoslovakia, to Greece, to the dozen other countries that are suffering in the grip of the imperialist powers or the local forces that they support and maintain. Still more important, the work initiated by the tribunal should be carried further by groups of citizens who take upon themselves the duty of discovering and making public the daily evidences of barbarism, and the still more severe duty of challenging the powers state or private that are responsible for violence and oppression, looking forward to the day when an anti-micro national movement of freedom and social justice will end their rule.